He lifted a hand to bid, and the valley held its breath. On a dust-choked afternoon in Whitlock Valley, the auction yard fell silent as Elias Boone, a worn, solitary man with little more than pride left, raised his hand to claim 4 orphans. It wasn't just a bit of dollars, it was the start of a promise, one that would demand sweat, blood, and a heart no one believed he still carried. He lifted a hand to bid, and the valley held its breath. Afternoon light leaned long across the churchyard in Whitlock, the kind of light that makes dust look like gold and trouble look like Sunday. The auctioneer's mallet tapped a nervous rhythm on the block, dry wood on dry wood, and folks clustered in the heat the way cattle do at a windbreak. 4 boys stood up on the plank stage like fence posts waiting on wire. Shirts thin, knees bony, faces streaked the color of road clay. Their eyes had that dull shine you see in window glass after a hailstorm. Elias Boone raised his hand once and didn't put it down. $20 for the lot, he said, steady as a fence corner, jaw set so tight you could have struck a match on it. Murmurs rolled through the crowd. Elias, the widower with a patch that hadn't given decent since the year before last. Elias, who took his coffee black and never sat with his back to a door. Buying trouble with both hands, they said without saying it. Bram Pike was there in a brown coat, cut clean as a banker's promise. The man smiled small like he was saving his real smile for a better customer and said, "Orphans," in a tone that made the word feel like a ledger entry. The auctioneer peered toward the church spire as if the bell might bail him out, sweat shining under his hat brim. No one much wanted the boys, not for meanness in them. They hadn't made a peep since the deputy marched them up, but because grief looks heavier than a plow and pays worse than rocks. "Sold, Mr. Boone," the auctioneer blurted, quick like pulling a tooth. Elias walked up the steps, his boots thudded slow. No rush in them. He stopped before the tallest boy. "Name?" "Tate," the boy said, voice rusty from disuse. Elias nodded once, moved down the line. "Caleb," a smaller nod. "Silas." He came to the last boy, the one hiding behind Silas with his toes curled over the board edge like he was bracing for the whole county to tilt. Elias didn't ask that one's name. He held out a hand, palm up, like a man offers a drink to a spooked horse. The boy didn't take it. He reached instead for the hem of Elias's coat, thumb rubbing the worn thread at the edge, and said one word so soft you had to lean to hear it. "Pa." It wasn't a shout or a claim. It sounded like a spark dropping into a coal bed that never fully went out. The platform went quiet enough to hear the flies change course. Somebody's wife breathed "Lord." A child asked too loud, "Why'd he say that?" and got hushed for his trouble. Bram Pike's smile didn't move, but his eyes did. Elias let the word hit and settle where it wanted. He didn't look around to see who heard it. This was between him and the boy, and the wind. He scooped the small one up, the way you'd lift a pup out of a wash, careful at the ribs, and stepped down. Tate and Caleb fell in behind without a glance to the crowd. Silas hesitated, one hand on his knee as if it pained him. Then followed 2. They crossed the yard under the spire's shadow. A tin cup sat sweating on the rail, and a wasp worried at the lip. The mule hitched to Elias's wagon swished its tail and tossed its head like it didn't care for the gathering. Elias set the little one, Jude, he'd learn, on the bench and took up the reins. He had planned for 4 bodies and little else. He had not planned for the ache that the word left in his chest, the way it shook something loose he'd stoned over 3 winters back. The wagon creaked away, boards talking to nails, dust lifting behind like breath on a cold morning. On the edge of town, right where the ruts spill onto open prairie, Bram Pike touched a gloved finger to his hat brim. His boots were polished too clean for a man who knew the weight of a shovel. "We'll talk, friend," he said, voice polite as a buttoned coat. Elias didn't answer. He set his heels gentle and clucked to the mule. The boys rode quiet, hands folded, the kind of quiet that doesn't belong to children. Tate watched the road. Caleb watched Elias's hands on the lines like he was learning a prayer. Silas stared down at his own shoes, lips tight with a pain that was none of Elias's business yet. Jude held the coat hem again, small fist working that same loose thread, eyes on Elias like a man looks at a map in a hard country. Whitlock's last fence fell behind them. The land opened, low grass scoured by wind, cottonwoods along a shallow draw, sky big enough to be its own kind of mercy. Elias could feel the eyes of town loosen off his back the further they went, but the word the boy had said didn't loosen. It sat there, warm and dangerous as a live coal in dry straw. The homestead came up mean and honest, a house that had kept out more weather than it had any right to, a barn that leaned a little, a stack of wood that wouldn't see them through a long winter. The porch squeaked under boot weight. Elias swung down, then lifted each boy off the wagon like he was measuring them for work he didn't yet know how to name. He opened the door. The room smelled of ash and lye soap and thyme. A quilt his wife had pieced during their first January hung on the peg like a season that refused to move on. "You'll bed down by the hearth for now," he said. "We'll sort proper later." "We've slept worse," Tate said, not bragging, just laying a thing on the table where it could be looked at. Elias dipped water from the basin. The boys washed in turn, eyes down, no splashing. Caleb flinched when the door moved. Silas set his weight careful when he knelt. Jude's forearms were ringed with fading bruise, little moons where someone else's hands had been. Elias asked nothing. Questions are like spooked cattle. They scatter what little calm you have. Night came on the way it does out there, quick once the light breaks on the far ridges. Elias lay on his own bunk and watched the ceiling boards collect the fire's flicker. The house made its old sounds, the stove ticking as it cooled, a mouse daring the flour tin, the mule shifting its weight outside. Footsteps came soft at the doorway. Elias reached for the rifle without thinking and stopped when he saw the small shadow. Jude stood there, bare feet on cold plank, hair sticking up any which way. He took 2 steps, then climbed onto the edge of the bed without asking, curled small on top of the quilt like a pup circling into heat. Elias didn't move him. He lay there and let the weight settle against the place that had been empty too long. In the dark, near asleep, the boy breathed that word again, the way a man says water in a dry dream. "Pa." Elias stared at the rafters until they blurred and let what came come. Some things you don't stop and wipe away. You just let them run where they're headed. A roof that leaks still keeps the night out. Elias woke to the sharp cold that always crept in right before dawn, the kind that bites under the blanket and pinches the nose. The hearth fire had faded to red embers, not enough to keep the chill off, but the boys slept pressed together like pups, making their own warmth in the flickering shadow. He watched them a moment, Tate curled toward the wall, Caleb with his knees up, Silas in a knot that never seemed to loosen, and little Jude clinging to the edge of the quilt, his mouth open in silent dreaming. Elias rose, pulled on his boots, and added another stick of wood to the stove. Careful not to wake anyone. He filled the battered tin pot, poured in black grounds, and set it atop the coals. The kitchen window was patched with paper and a nail, but morning slid through anyway, painting pale lines across the table and over the scarred old ledger. He stood quiet, watching the coffee bubble and hiss, breathing in the sharp comfort of its bitterness. Sometimes it was the only thing that cut through the ache in his chest. The boys woke one by one, slow and silent. Tate was the first up, eyes wary but not afraid. He found the bucket and fetched water without asking, moving like he'd lived the rhythm of chores his whole life. Caleb set the battered pan by the door and brushed the dust from his pants. Silas limped as he crossed the room, but made no complaint. Elias caught it, though, and made a note in the back of his mind. Old injuries leave quiet marks. "Breakfast," Elias said, not raising his voice. He dished out beans and cornmeal, the last of the ham bone boiled into the pot. They ate quick, heads down, the way boys do when they've learned food is best. Not wasted, and nothing's promised for supper. Jude chewed slow, eyes never leaving Elias, as if he were trying to learn the man's shape and the mood behind his silence. After, Elias set about showing them the place. He led them out under a sky already bleaching to white, the grass stiff with last frost, and pointed at the fences that needed fixing, the barn that leaned, the well where water ran cold and deep. He didn't speak much, just a word for this, a nod for that. The boys listened, taking in the weight of work like it was the only steady thing in a world built on shifting ground. They didn't complain, didn't ask for more. Tate hauled kindling and tried the barn latch twice to make sure it caught. Caleb dragged a rake across the yard, shooing chickens without ever raising his voice. Silas sat on the porch step, cleaning his shoes, jaw tight against the pain in his leg. Jude followed Elias like a shadow, never quite touching, but always near enough for the hem of his coat to brush the boy's hand when the wind changed. At noon, Elias brought out the jug and filled each tin cup. Watching the way the boys drank, measured, careful, no sloshing. He saw the lines on their faces, the dirt under their nails, the way their shoulders curled inward like they were bracing for the next blow. He wondered about their story, but knew better than to ask. Questions could wait. Trust was a thing earned slow, like rain in drought. That afternoon, the boys did as they were told, and a little more. Tate patched a split rail with a rock wedged tight. Caleb swept the stoop clean. Silas found a loose hinge and set about fixing it with an old nail and a stone. Elias watched them out the window, his coffee cooling in his hand, feeling something in his chest begin to shift. A quiet hope, sharp as the cry of a red hawk far off over the hills. The sun was dipping low by the time chores were finished. The boys huddled by the hearth as the wind picked up, carrying the smell of smoke and snow from the high country. Elias set another pot to simmer, beans again, but this time he dropped in a few slices of potato and let the smell fill the cabin. The boys didn't talk much, didn't fight or fuss. They ate together, each one glancing now and then at Elias as if weighing whether to ask for more or simply to be allowed to stay. Night came early. The house shrank down to just the circle of warmth thrown by the fire and the scratch of wind at the windows. Jude was the last to climb into his blankets, nestling so close to Elias's cot that the man could feel the boy's breath on his arm. "We've had worse," Tate whispered as if that explained everything. Elias nodded. "This'll do for now." In the dark, Jude's hand found his coat again, thumb working the loose thread. He didn't say a word, but Elias felt the weight of it, a question hanging in the silence, heavier than all the words that came before. He lay awake long after the boys slept, listening to the wind scrape the eaves and the distant bark of a coyote. The stove clicked and cooled. The coffee pot gleamed dull in the firelight. He let his thoughts wander to the years behind him, the wife whose hands had sewn the quilt, the empty stretch of land he'd tried to make into a life. Now 4 boys slept under his roof, each carrying scars, each looking to him for a kind of answer he wasn't sure he could give, but the roof still held, the fire still burned. It was a start. Then came the knock, 3 hard raps sharp as a judge's gavel, echoing through the wood and bone of that old house. Sometimes paper weighs more than a man's word. The knock rattled the front door and hung in the air, stubborn as winter. Elias set his cup aside, wiped his hands on his trousers, and strode to the threshold. The boys tensed, Tate's back straightening, Caleb's hand darting for Silas's, Jude scooting closer to the hearth as if the flames might shield him from whatever waited outside. Elias opened the door to Bram Pike standing tall on the stoop, coat buttoned sharp, hat set neat. The man looked more out of place than a banker at a branding, his boots polished and dry, no dust clinging to the leather. "Afternoon, Boone," Pike said, the edges of his voice buttered with just enough respect to sound insincere. "Mind if I step in?" "You've got business. Speak it," Elias replied, holding firm in the doorway. Pike's smile didn't reach his eyes. He slipped a folded document from his coat pocket, flicked it with 2 fingers, and let the county seal glint in the slanting light. "I've come for the boys. There's been a mistake. Legal matter, nothing personal. They're indentured to my establishment outside Yarrow Bend, my property on record." Elias felt Tate's eyes on his back, the heat of 4 lives balanced behind him. He kept his voice low. "I bought them fair at auction. The papers were clear." Pike cocked his head as if considering a stray calf. "You know how it goes, Boone. Sometimes the truth ain't what's on the ledger. Sometimes it's what a man can prove." He stepped forward, the toe of his boot scraping the porch, just enough to test the line between threat and talk. "I'll be back with the sheriff and more paperwork. You can show yours, I'll show mine, and the law will sort it. But those boys, they're more valuable than they look." The words landed heavy, leaving the house colder than the wind outside. Jude peeked around the doorframe, small fingers whitening on the wood. Elias glanced down at him, then shifted his weight just enough to block the boy from Pike's line of sight. "This is my roof," Elias said, voice flat as an anvil. "You want what's under it? You'll need more than paper." Pike's lips curled in a polite shape, but there was nothing warm in it. "I'm not a man who likes waiting, Boone. I'll give you a day or 2. Enough time to get your story straight." He tapped the folded document against his palm, then slipped it back into his coat. The dust from the yard tried to sneak past him into the house, but Elias slammed the door, shutting out the cold and the words, both. He turned. The boys were gathered near the table, Tate's chin up but jaw set, Caleb's face pale, Silas clutching a battered bucket, Jude biting his lip, silent as stone. For a moment, nobody moved. Elias knelt by the hearth, poking at the embers with the poker, watching the sparks scatter and die. "No one's taking you," he said, "not to the fire, not to the boys, not even, sure, to himself." That night, worry threaded the air like smoke. After the boys bedded down, Tate climbed up and flipped through the old ledger again, fingers tracing numbers that didn't add up to comfort. Outside, the wind picked up, clawing at the house, whistling through the cracks. Elias sat by the window, shotgun within reach, eyes fixed on the yard. The moon lit the porch, shining over the old rocking chair and the pair of boots he'd set out to dry. He listened, to wind, to breathing, to the old boards shifting under the weight of memory. Out in the barn, Caleb sat with his back against a hay bale, a pocket knife glinting as he whittled a thin stick into a point. Silas sat nearby, hands wrapped around the handle of a tin bucket, knuckles white. "He'll come back," Silas whispered. Caleb nodded once, never looking up from the knife. "They always do." Inside, Jude dreamed restless, twitching under the quilt, while Elias kept his silent vigil, knowing that in the West, paper could hang a man faster than rope, and some threats never knocked twice before pushing through. A ledger tells the truth, men avoid saying. It was Tate who found it, the old book with its cracked spine and dog-eared pages perched on the edge of the table beside the empty coffee cup. Morning sun bled through the patched window, striping the floor, making dust motes dance in the quiet. Tate ran his finger down the numbers, lips moving soundlessly, eyes dark with calculation. 3 months behind on land tax, he said, almost to himself, but loud enough for Elias to catch across the room. The man bristled, shoulders rising as he set the kettle on the stove. That's my business. Tate closed the ledger with a thump, but didn't flinch from the look Elias sent him. It's all our business now. Anybody eats under this roof, sleeps here, owes something back. There was a silence, deep as the bottom of a well. The boys watched Elias, waiting for him to bark or send them out. But he only shook his head once, lips pressed thin. He pulled on his boots, grabbed his old hat, and jerked his chin toward the door. Come on, you'll see what needs doing. Outside, the sky was hard and blue as enamel, not a cloud to break it. Elias led the boys down the path, boots scuffing gravel, a gust of wind tugging at coat hems and hair. He pointed to the waterline, dry as a preacher's mouth, showed them where the brush climbed too close to the fence and how the plow should turn when earth was soft. He explained the way the creek shifted each spring, how roots held a bank steady, why you never trusted a green shoot to anchor soil. The boys listened, heads nodding in that slow, careful way of children who know not to interrupt. Tate's hands found a rusted bucket and a length of wire. Caleb set to clearing rocks from the turn row. Silas limped behind him, stooping to gather kindling. Jude kept close to Elias, his hand never far from the tail of the man's coat. When the chores were done, Elias boiled up beans and set out black bread left from yesterday. They ate at the battered table, elbows on wood, shoulders brushing, awkward at first, then settling into a rhythm, the kind that feels older than any of them can remember. Evening came with a copper sky, wind shivering the porch rail. After supper, as the fire flickered low, Jude lingered by Elias's side. "Can I stay up a little?" he asked, voice almost too soft to hear. Elias nodded, tugged the quilt up around the boy's shoulders. Jude crawled into his lap, settling as if he'd always belonged there. "Are we really yours?" the boy whispered, thumb working the threadbare edge of the coat. Elias looked down at the boy, then at the 3 others, scattered across the hearth. Tate cleaning his boots, Caleb reading the only Bible page with half the words left, Silas gazing out the window as if expecting someone to appear. "I don't know what to call it yet," Elias said after a moment, his voice rough with years unsaid. "But I'm not leaving. I'll be here. You're under my roof." Jude nodded, eyes closing. The trust was given, fragile as new grass but strong enough to hold for now. The quiet broke with a sudden pounding on the door, brisk, official, the kind of knock that doesn't wait to be invited. Elias stood, shifting Jude to the chair, and strode across the floor. He opened the door to find the sheriff standing there, hat in hand, Bram Pike a step behind with his mouth set in a thin line. The sheriff's hand gripped a sheaf of papers, county seal bright under the lantern's glow. Elias tensed, jaw working as the boys drew near, crowding behind his legs. "We need to talk, Boone," the sheriff said. "Got paperwork says these boys belong to another man." Pike's smile flickered, and for a heartbeat, the house felt too small for all the ghosts crowding in. Before a word could be said, Jude stepped forward, a crumpled scrap of paper clutched tight in his small hand. He looked up at Elias, then at the sheriff, eyes wide but clear. He held it out. Ink from a good man can break iron chains. For a second, the sheriff just stared at the wrinkled scrap in Jude's hand, as if it might burn him. Bram Pike stiffened behind him, the set of his mouth sliding from smug to sour. Elias nodded at Jude, giving the smallest of encouragements. The boy stepped forward, the paper trembling between his fingers. The sheriff took it slow, unfolding the page with care. The lantern threw shaky shadows across the room as he squinted at the faded writing, lips moving while he read. A hush fell. Tate leaned closer. Caleb's hands knotted at his sides. Silas glanced between Elias and Pike, waiting for the wind to shift. Reverend Josiah Hale's name was scrawled across the bottom, the county seal pressed deep beside it. The letter told a story none of the boys had ever spoken, of 4 brothers left kinless after a fever took their parents, placed by the Reverend in temporary care, then spirited away one cold night by men with forged papers and hungry eyes. It was notarized, dated, real as the ache in Elias's chest. The sheriff compared it to Pike's documents. "Yours is smudged, Bram. Signatures off. Dates don't match up." He held up both sheets to the lamp. "This here's a real letter. This," he jabbed Pike's with a finger, "isn't worth spit in July." Pike's nostrils flared. "I paid for those boys. They're mine by law and labor." "You paid a thief," the sheriff shot back, "and now you'll answer for it." Elias stood between Pike and the boys, body solid as the barn's stone foundation. The anger inside him was old and cold, but it moved his hand quick. One punch straight to Pike's jaw sent the man sprawling against the porch rail. The sheriff barely blinked. "I didn't see that," he said, voice flat. He reached down and snapped cuffs on Pike's wrists, hauling him up with no more care than you'd give a sack of feed. "Come morning, you'll see the judge. Boone, you want to keep those boys? You'd better get your papers in order. It'll be a rough day or two. Folks who want orphans never do quit easy." Tate stared after the sheriff and Pike as they disappeared down the walk, the night swallowing their shadows. "What now?" he asked, voice dry as dust. Elias looked to the battered table, the empty ledger, the boys standing unsure in their own house. He knelt so his eyes were level with Tate's. "Now we make this family right. All the way." The house settled around them, fire hissing, wind tapping the window pane, Jude clutching the letter so tight it left creases in his palm. Elias poured coffee he'd forgotten to finish, feeling the weight in his chest change shape. It wasn't dread anymore, it was hope, stubborn as a weed and just as hard to root out. Later, when the boys finally slept, Elias found himself alone on the porch. He stared up at the stars, hands curled tight around a mug gone cold, listening to the prairie hold its breath. Somewhere, a coyote called out. Elias took it for a sign, rough, honest, refusing to be silent. By first light, he'd saddled the mule, packed half a loaf of bread, and tucked the Reverend's letter into his coat. He left a note for the boys beside the warm loaf rising by the stove. "Gone to town. Back by sunset. Stay close." As he rode out, the sky was pale with coming day. Tate, Caleb, Silas, and Jude stood at the fence line watching him disappear into the blue. None waved, but none turned away. The world was changing. And this time Elias was going to fight for the change. To stick. Some papers are just promises, pinned to earth. Elias rode the rutted road to Laram in a hush, broken only by the mule's breath and the squeak of old harness leather. Each mile brought him closer to what he owed, not just to the county but to the boys left waiting on the rise, watching for the dust of his return. The landscape rolled by, cottonwoods bare against the sky, fences mended by hands he remembered, smoke from a distant cook fire rising into the kind of blue that only happens after a hard rain. Laram was half ruined, a church with a roof sagging under the weight of snow, windows dark, paint peeled by wind. The graveyard crouched close, stones tilted, names faded, but the records office still stood, and inside, behind the last pew, sat Reverend Josiah Hale. His hands were folded in his lap, shoulders hunched in the old way of men who have outlived most things except their regrets. Elias stepped in, hat in hand, boots echoing on bare planks. "Reverend," the old man looked up, blinking the way a man does when he's been deep in prayer. His face broke into something like a smile, a hope that had been left to dry out too long. "Boone, 4 of them, right?" The ones I prayed for every day after they vanished." His voice was soft but sturdy. Elias nodded, shoulders loosening for the first time in months. "You wrote that letter, saved us all, but the fight's not done. I need custody on paper and in the eyes of any judge still breathing in Red Butte County." Hale nodded, reaching for his pen with hands that shook only a little. Sometimes the devil finds a way to cross T's that decent men can't, but God keeps a record and I keep one too. He laid out the forms, one for each boy, lines for names and ages, signatures and oaths. Boone filled them out slow, block letters that showed the kind of care that costs a man sleep. The Reverend signed every page, pressing his seal so hard the wax bled through the parchment. When it was done, Hale leaned back, breath shaky. "You'll face more than paper. The men that took those boys, men like Pike, men like that shadow in the county who buys up orphans like mules, they don't give up. You ready for that?" Elias looked out the window, watching the light climb over broken stained glass. "I ain't never run from a fight that was worth the bruises. I'm not starting now." Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the street in molten orange. Elias tucked the papers into his coat, tipped his hat, and left the Reverend nodding in the dim. He rode home through a dusk stitched with cold and a promise, a house full of boys waiting to know if the world could hold steady long enough for them to grow roots. At the homestead, Tate, Caleb, Silas, and Jude were lined up along the rail fence, boots caked with mud, eyes fixed on the empty road. Jude broke first, sprinting across the yard, arms wide. Boone swung down and caught the boy, lifting him into the saddle just to feel the weight and warmth. "Next time, we all go," Jude said, breathless, laughter bubbling up from some place he'd hidden too long. Inside, the house was warmer than he'd left it. Mary Hart and her little girl Lark had arrived by chance and storm, clothes damp, eyes wary, hands chapped raw. "We came from the mine camps south. Rain drove us out, trouble behind." Mary's words were few and careful, each one shaped like a door just cracked. Elias offered them a place by the fire, no questions. "Barn's dry, house is warmer. You can stay as long as you need." Mary nodded, pulling Lark closer, settling her on a bedroll near the hearth. Lark didn't speak, just pressed her cheek into her mother's dress and stared at the flames. Later, after the house quieted, Elias caught Mary scrubbing the stove. He could see the miles behind her eyes, the pain she carried in every knuckle and nail. She glanced at him once, something unspoken passing between people who have seen storms break good men. Night pressed in, wind rattling the shutters, making the lamp flicker and shadows jump. Jude curled up near Boone's cot, sleeping with one fist around the corner of his coat. When Elias rose at first light to stoke the fire, a letter was wedged beneath the porch boards, a black seal glinting in the dawn, and handwriting that felt colder than frost. "Blood calls blood," or so the wicked say. Elias found the letter as the sun was barely rising. Thin paper, black wax, crushed and smeared, ink bled into the grain like poison into well water. He broke the seal with his thumb, feeling its chill, and read, "One was mine. I'll have him back." No name, no signature, just that sentence cut short as a threat. He slipped the letter into his coat, turning it over in his mind. Jude was awake already, silent in the corner, eyes tracking every move Elias made. Outside, the wind dragged dust across the yard, the sky gone steel gray with the promise of rain that never came. At breakfast, Elias kept quiet, but Mary Hart saw the tightness in his jaw. She washed dishes with rough hands, glancing over at him. "What is it?" she asked, voice low. He handed her the letter. Mary read it, face tightening. "Which one?" she asked, eyes hard as river stones. "Jude," Elias said. He didn't bother to hide the worry. "Someone came, years back, said he was kin, but the Reverend wouldn't let him take the boy without proof. At the table, Caleb watched the way Elias and Miri spoke in half whispers. When the others had gone outside, he lingered by the door. "I remember that man," Caleb said. "Came when our parents died, said Jude was special blood. Wouldn't look at the rest of us. Left when the Reverend made him show papers. I never saw him again till the auction. Thought he was gone for good." Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder, steady and strong. "You did right. Sometimes the best you can do is wait and hope the world forgets you." He didn't say it, but he knew the world never forgets. Not really. Sheriff was gone to Cheyenne. No law to lean on, no backup to call. Miri set her jaw. "So what now?" "We wait," Elias said. "We keep our eyes open. If he comes, I'll handle it." That afternoon, Silas was missing from chores. Elias found him out by the old back trail, a bundle tied up in a handkerchief, eyes red from holding in fear. "You running?" Elias asked. Silas wiped his nose with the back of his hand. "Heard you and Caleb talk. Thought if I warned the Dorseys up the road, maybe they'd watch our backs." Elias crouched, boots crunching gravel, voice gentle but firm. "I already sent word. You're not a burden, Silas. None of you are. You want to help? Stay close, keep your eyes sharp, and trust that I know which way the wind's blowing." That night, the house was restless. No one slept easy. Miri hummed a hymn while she stitched patches on Lark's old dress. The boys gathered around the fire, Tate with his head bent over the ledger, Caleb fixing the loose board at the door, Silas stringing a line for traps, Jude curled in Elias's lap, thumb pressed to the hem of his coat. The house filled with the quiet sound of living. Breath, stitch, the tick of the old clock on the shelf. Before bed, Jude spoke softly, his voice threading through the hush. "You think God can hear us all the way out here?" Elias brushed the boy's hair from his eyes. "He hears you louder than anyone, son, especially out here where the wind never stops." The night outside pressed tight, thick with the promise of something coming. A coyote called across the flats. Elias sat by the window, rifle across his knees, listening for footsteps or the crack of a branch. In the prairie dark, every sound felt like a question, every shadow a warning. The first drops of rain hit the roof, slow and heavy. Elias didn't move. He just listened and waited. Morning broke with a hush, the kind that makes every sound seem bigger. The boys moved slow, faces drawn from a night spent chasing sleep that wouldn't come. Elias stoked the fire and poured coffee, his hand steady, his mind anything but. He watched Jude, who lingered by the window, eyes following a crow picking at the frost-gnawed yard. When the house grew quiet, Elias went to gather eggs. He returned to find Jude's blanket tossed in a heap and the front door cracked open. Wind blew in, carrying a sharp scent of wet earth and something gone wrong. On the kitchen table, scrawled in crayon on the back of an old feed sack, was a note. The letters were shaky but sure. "Gone to find him, don't come." The world tightened around Elias's ribs. He called the boys. Tate and Caleb ran the fence line. Silas climbed the old oak, scanning the horizon. Miri checked the road, eyes bright with worry, Lark at her side. "He's headed for the ravine," Elias said, already pulling on his coat and loading shells into the rifle. "That's where the sheriff found them last time. He always gets quiet near the creek." Elias followed the trail, heart beating like hoofbeats in his ears. He found the first sign by the river, Jude's coat snagged on a thorn, a drop of blood on the rock below. Nothing big, just a scrape, but enough to drive him faster. Further on, the path forked, and boot prints, the wrong size for any child, joined the smaller tracks, veering toward Devil's Wash, a gulch, thick with willow and shadow. Elias moved careful, rifle in hand, breath short, voices carried in the wind, a man's low and smooth, and Jude's soft as dusk. He crept close and saw them, Bram Pike out of his cuffs and dressed in a black duster, standing over Jude, one hand resting heavy on the boy's shoulder, the other playing at the handle of his pistol. Jude looked small, smaller than ever, but he stood his ground, chin up, fists clenched at his sides. "I came on my own," Jude said, voice trembling. "Want to know if you're really him." Pike's smile was sharp, all wolf and teeth. "I knew you were mine soon as I saw you. Got the eyes, the blood. You're worth something, boy, different from the rest." Jude frowned, glancing down at the ground. "Why not them? Why only me?" "They're just strays. You're the one I want." Pike crouched, voice turning. "Slick. Come with me. I'll show you things your so-called family never could. The world's bigger than this patch of dust." Jude shook his head. "I don't feel different." Elias stepped from the brush, rifle raised, voice hard as iron. "Let go of him." Pike straightened slow, didn't look surprised. "Boone, I wondered when you'd show." I said, "Let him go." Pike smiled wider. "You going to shoot me over a boy that don't even share your name?" Elias didn't waver. "Staying makes you a father. Paper don't mean nothing out here." Jude looked between the two men, breath hitching. Then he took a step back, away from Pike into the shadow where Elias stood. "I don't want to go," he whispered, voice just a thread. The smile fell off Pike's face. "This ain't over," he spat, pushing past Elias and vanishing into the brush, boots silent as regret. Elias dropped to one knee, pulling Jude into his arms, holding him as tight as the boy would allow. "You okay?" Jude nodded, eyes glassy, arms wrapped around Elias's neck. "Thought maybe I needed to know, but I don't. I already do." They rode home slow, side by side. When they crested the rise, the house glowed gold in the late light, smoke curling from the chimney, and the others ran to meet them. Nobody asked questions. Jude walked straight to the hearth, pulled the hymn book from the shelf, and pressed it into Elias's hands. "Can we sing?" Elias opened to the old song, the one his wife had loved, and his voice cracked on the first line. But the others joined in, and by the last verse, the house felt whole, if only for the length of a prayer. Outside, the wind rose and fell, carrying away Pike's words and the last echo of the threat. Inside, Elias lay awake by the fire, boots on, rifle close. But for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel alone in the dark. Night pressed close, thick as wool, when Elias heard the soft tap at the barn door. The wind had died, and the whole prairie listened. He slipped outside, rifle loose in his hand, boots careful on the frost-hardened earth. There, hunched in the dark, was a boy, older than Tate, maybe 16, cheeks sunken, hands shaking so bad he could barely hold his hat. Elias didn't lower the rifle. "You alone?" The boy nodded, eyes huge, voice little more than a croak. "Was following your lights, mister. Ain't here to steal, just hungry." Miri was already behind him, Lark's hand gripped tight. "Come on, son," she said gently. "We got broth if you'll take it." Inside, Huck Mather sat curled by the stove, slurping soup as if every spoonful might vanish. His wrists showed the raw red burn of rope, skin cracked and angry. He ate in silence, but his eyes darted to every window, every door, like he'd spent too many nights listening for footsteps. Jude crept close. "I seen him before," he whispered to Elias, voice tight. "With the man in the black coat." Elias pulled up a chair, crouched to the boy's level. "What's your name?" "Huck, sir. Huck Mather. I ran from him. The man calls himself P. Never gives a real name, says folks like us don't need one." "How long you been with him?" 3 years, maybe more. He finds boys, uses them, trades them, trained us to work, stay quiet, disappear when told. If you tried to run, he made you pay." Miri knelt to check his wrists, face kind but set. "He follow you here, Huck?" The boy's head jerked. I don't know. He don't usually let nobody go, but I hid, waited for dark, and just kept running. Elias nodded, jaw tight. You can stay, but if he comes, we won't send you back. That night, nobody slept well. Mary packed extra blankets in the root cellar. Tate checked the locks. Caleb mapped every trail. Out of the homestead with a stick on the dirt floor. Silas hung up a bell by the back window while Jude clung to Elias's coat, so tight his knuckles turned white. Elias moved all the food stores into crates. Flour, salt, canned beans, anything that could last if they needed to vanish. He kept the rifle loaded, boots at the ready, mind ticking through every way a man might try to take what wasn't his. The prairie settled in uneasy. Somewhere, far off, coyotes howled, and the barn creaked as if it remembered every child who'd ever hid in its hay. Just before dawn, as Elias stepped out to check the yard, he smelled it, smoke, thick and oily, snaking from behind the shed. His heart seized. He ran, feet pounding, as a shout went up from Tate at the window. The shed was ablaze, orange licking at the sky, hungry and wild. Caleb and Elias cut the horses loose. Mary grabbed the bucket brigade, but the barn's side was already alight, embers hopping from plank to plank. By the time the fire died, half the roof was gone. Blackened timbers steamed in the pale morning. Ash dusted every surface, coating boots, faces, hands. Huck stared at the ruins, shoulders hunched, voice small. He always burns what he can't take. Elias put a hand on the boy's shoulder, solid and real. Not this time. Then Tate yelled, voice strangled by panic. Jude's gone! His blanket's cold! He's not here! Elias spun, eyes catching a set of tracks, small and dragged, leading away into the gray dawn. There was no note, only the open window and the sound of the wind whispering through the blackened rafters. The storm wasn't coming. It was here. Fire talks first, questions later. Elias's boots were still scorched from running the barn when he caught sight of the tracks. 2 sets in the ash, one small and shuffling, one longer and deep. The shed's beams hissed and cracked as the last flames died, sending up smoke that stung eyes and filled lungs. The boys stood stunned, faces streaked with soot, Silas coughing hard, Tate rubbing a blistered hand. Mary clutched Lark and Huck, both wide-eyed in the gray morning light. Jude's tracks, Caleb said, voice hollow. But look, someone else. Elias knelt, tracing the marks with a calloused finger. A streak of blood caught his eye, just a bead, but bright as a warning. He followed the trail beyond the yard, through scrub and stunted willow, past the rise where coyotes sometimes gathered. The world was washed in silence, only the far-off clang of a loose tin roof somewhere in the wind. The tracks cut north, heading for Cold Hollow, an old homestead half swallowed by briars and rot. Elias moved fast, heart a hammer in his chest. He kept low, rifle ready, every sense sharpened to the shape of threat. The closer he got, the more signs he found. The heel drag of a child too tired to run, tobacco spit fresh on the rock, a hasty boot print by a fallen log. He smelled them before he saw them. Men who hadn't bathed in weeks, the sour stink of fear and old whiskey. He stopped behind a copse of dead cedar, peered out. There, by a toppled chicken coop, 2 rough men stood guard, eyes sharp, hands never far from their pistols. Jude was tied to a fence post, rope biting his wrists, hair plastered to his forehead with sweat and soot. Bram Pike crouched beside him, voice oily and low, spinning promises and threats in equal measure. You remember how I carried you, Pike crooned. How I taught you to fish. That man back there, he ain't your kin. He's just filling a hole in his life. Jude's eyes found the ground. His fingers twitched, working at the knot. Elias moved, fast and silent, circling the clearing. When the guard nearest the trees turned his back, Elias lunged. One blow with the rifle butt, and the man dropped, limp and quiet. The second guard spun, pistol rising, but Elias fired a warning shot into the ground. The man bolted, vanishing into the brush. Pike stood, pistol drawn, pressing the muzzle to Jude's shoulder. "Back up, Boone," he spat, sweat beading at his brow. "Or I'll—" Before he could finish, a gunshot cracked through the air, sharp as ice. Pike's pistol jerked out of his hand. Caleb, trembling, stood at the edge of the trees, the smoke curling from the little Colt in his fist. Elias dashed forward, cutting Jude free, pulling the boy to his chest. "You all right?" Jude nodded, burying his face in Elias's shirt. Pike staggered, hand bleeding, teeth bared. "You'll never keep him, or any of them. There's always someone willing to pay more." Elias didn't answer. He bound Pike's wrists and dragged him to a fence post, lashing him tight. The rest of the night they camped in the clearing, rifles close, backs to the fire, eyes always on the dark beyond the ring of light. When dawn finally broke, the sky was dull gold. Jude sat beside Elias, wrapped in a blanket. "Do you still want us?" he asked, voice raw. Elias stared at the boy, at the others gathered close. Caleb with the pistol loose in his lap. Tate rubbing his eyes, Silas cradling his injured hand. "Want you?" Elias echoed, voice thick. "I want you, all of you. Not because of what you are or where you come from, but because you're mine, if you'll have me." Jude didn't answer, just leaned into Elias, letting himself be held. They rode home slow together, as the fields woke to another hard day. A house can stand after fire, if the hearts inside don't fall. The sun climbed slow and pale over Boone Homestead, lighting up the scars from the night before. Smoke still curled from the ruined barn, paint blistered on the fence rails. The porch steps, blackened at the edge, creaked beneath tired feet. But the house stood. Timbers cracked, roof patched in places, but still holding. The boys returned like a tide, slow and silent. Caleb limped in first, shoulders set, eyes scanning for trouble. Tate followed, leading the mule, its flanks smeared with ash. Silas paused at the stoop, hands full of small, whittled dolls he'd carved from burnt fence posts. He buried them under a marker stone, one for each of them, just in case the worst came to pass. Jude clung to Elias, thumb working the same threadbare edge of his coat, never more than a foot away. Inside, Mary Hart scrubbed soot from the table while Lark dusted off the shelf, her silence a comfort in its own right. Huck Mather stayed close to the wall, eyes wide as if he might vanish at any moment. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, boiled coffee, and something new. Hope, cautious and flickering. No one spoke of the fire's start, nor of Pike, who'd been hauled off at sunrise by the sheriff and a pair of hard-eyed deputies from Red Butte. No one asked what would come next. They only moved, slow and steady, picking up the pieces. Mary washed Silas's hands and knelt to whisper something, her voice soft as falling ash. Caleb sat by the window, polishing the little Colt that had saved them all, jaw set with a pride he wouldn't speak aloud. Tate fetched fresh boards, fixing the porch rail with nails hammered straight and true. Jude set about gathering eggs, checking each one for cracks, holding them as gentle as secrets. Elias patched the roof, hammer swinging steady. Huck joined him, quiet but willing, passing up boards, learning where to place his weight so the old shingles didn't buckle. The two worked without much talk, the only sound the steady thud of nails and the distant squawk of chickens reclaiming the yard. In the afternoon, word came from town. Someone was asking about 4 orphan boys, offering gold for news. A stranger rough-voiced and riding a horse too fine for these parts. Mary heard it from a merchant who'd stopped for water. She relayed the news in a whisper, worry sharpening her gaze. Elias listened, then nodded. He went to the shed, oiled the rifle, and laid it across the porch rails. "We keep close," he said, "and keep our eyes sharp." No more surprises. As dusk fell, the family gathered by the hearth. Miri ladled out soup, passing the battered pot from hand to hand. Tate read aloud from a Bible page, voice stumbling but earnest. Caleb and Silas played at cards with Huck, the laughter hesitant but growing stronger as night deepened. Lark perched in Miri's lap, tracing the whirls in the wood floor. Jude curled up beside Elias, resting his head on the man's knee. "Will it ever stop?" he asked, voice soft as breath. Elias brushed the hair from Jude's forehead, gaze lingering on the black marks that stained the windowsill and the patched corner of the roof. "It won't ever be easy, son, but you got a place here now, and I ain't going anywhere." Outside, the wind rattled what was left of the fence, making the tin rooster on the gate spin lazy circles. The prairie was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes only after a storm. That night, Elias left his boots by the door, but kept the rifle within reach. He stared at the ceiling, counting each slow breath, listening for trouble and for the gentle, sleeping breaths of the boys who now called this battered place home. "If you want what's mine, come through me." The day broke brittle and still. No birds sang, and even the wind seemed to hush. Boone Homestead sat in a ring of silence, the kind that crawls under the skin and warns of trouble before a word is spoken. The family rose early, moving through chores with quick, tense hands. Tate stacked wood by the stove. Caleb set water to boil. Miri shushed Lark's questions, her eyes never leaving the window. Elias checked the locks twice, then once more, rifle in hand. The sun dropped, stretching shadows long across the yard. It was Tate who first noticed. The birds gone from the fence, their usual chatter silent. Caleb paused in the doorway, frowning. No dust trail, but something's coming. Elias didn't hesitate. "Miri, take the kids to the cellar. Huck, you too." They didn't argue. The family slipped below, the door sealed behind them. Elias stood on the porch, rifle ready, boots planted. The boards creaked under his weight, a familiar sound in a world gone strange. They came at dusk, 4 riders, faces hidden by kerchiefs and low brim hats, coats caked with old mud and darker stains. They reined in just short of the porch. The leader raised his hand, voice flat as the plains. "You got what's ours." Elias didn't answer, gaze steady. The man spat, his horse pawing the dust. "We want the boys, now." "No," Elias said, voice low but carrying. "You want them, you'll have to take me first." The leader tilted his head, hand dropping to the pistol at his side. "You willing to die for 4 strays?" "Yes." The standoff broke like a bone. The rider drew, but Elias fired first, his shot dropping the horse from under the man, who rolled into the dirt cursing. Chaos exploded. Another rider flanked the porch, gun raised, but Caleb stepped from the cellar's shadow, firing point blank. The second rider toppled, coat flaring out, dust rising. The third came from the barn, but Miri, quiet Miri, waited behind the door, swinging a shovel with all her strength. It landed with a sound like splitting firewood. The last man turned to run. Elias caught him at the gate, wrestling him to the ground and binding his wrists with baling twine. Blood seeped from a cut above his eyebrow, but he glared up, defiant, until Elias hauled him to his feet. They buried the dead in the field, no word said, only a ring of stones set over fresh earth. When it was done, Elias leaned the rifle against the porch and called the family out. The night was cool, wind rattling the burned fence, the moon rising fat and gold above the barn's charred roof. Elias sat on the porch steps, boots muddy, hands shaking only a little. "I need to tell y'all something," he said. The boys gathered close, Tate, Caleb, Silas, Jude, shoulders pressed tight, Miri and Lark lingering behind. "I know I never asked you for anything," Elias began, voice rough as gravel. "I just showed up and tried to do the right thing, but I want this official. I want to adopt you." All of you, if you'll have me." The boys were quiet, breath shallow. Then Jude stepped forward, wrapped his arms around Elias's neck, held tight. Caleb, Tate, and Silas followed, one by one, clinging to him in the dusk. "Yes," Jude whispered. Elias pressed his face into the boy's hair, letting the tears fall where nobody could see. A name is a place to rest. 2 weeks after the riders fell, a circuit judge passed through Whitlock, rain trailing at his heels, the kind that smelled of new earth and old promises. Elias wore his best shirt, frayed at the collar but clean. The boys lined up in boots polished with bacon grease and spit, eyes shining, hair slicked down with river water. Miri stood behind them, a steady hand on Lark's shoulder, Huck tucked beside the door, quiet but present. The judge sat at the kitchen table, spectacles low on his nose. The county papers spread before him like a fresh-plowed field. Reverend Hale had come too, walking slow from the church, hat in hand, voice soft but proud as he vouched for every boy. Elias handed over the stack, applications signed in his rough script, each name filled in careful as prayer. Tate Boone, Caleb Boone, Silas Boone, Jude Boone. The judge reviewed every page, pausing at the edges where coffee rings and thumbprints marked the journey these papers had taken. Outside, the rain fell steady, washing the ash from the porch and carrying the last of the old dust down the lane. At last, the judge pressed the county seal, heavy and final. "That's that, Mr. Boone," he said, voice gruff but kind. "They're yours, all the way. Make it good." Reverend Hale nodded, signing his own name in trembling hand. "A man can build a house alone, Elias, but he can't fill it by himself." Elias swallowed hard, unable to speak for a moment. The boys just stood there, Tate biting his lip, Caleb blinking fast, Silas shifting his weight from foot to foot, Jude clutching the new paper in both hands as if afraid it might vanish. Miri served coffee all around, and for a while the house was filled with nothing but the clink of cups and the gentle hush of rain. Later that day, the family walked home under a sky broken by gold. Tate carried the new ledger with all 4 names, careful not to let it get wet. Caleb swung the gate open wide. Silas ran ahead to the porch and hammered up a new sign, Boone Homestead, carved into a fresh board, the paint still tacky under his thumb. Inside, Elias made supper while the boys set the table, laughter bubbling up in snatches, the kind of happiness that can only come after too much grief. Huck slipped into a chair without being asked, and Lark hung her ribbon on the newel post, her eyes shining. Night settled gentle. They gathered by the fire, hymn book open, voices rising in the old tune, the same one Jude had chosen when hope felt farthest. Silas nodded off first, head heavy on Caleb's shoulder. Tate poked at the embers. Jude curled up beside Elias, new paper folded tight in his fist. Just before sleep took him, Jude whispered into Elias's shirt, voice thick with dreams, "Pa?" Elias didn't cry, not then, but later, after everyone had gone quiet, he stepped out under the stars, the weight of years dropping away, and said thank you to the sky. Thank you for every name he'd been given and everyone he'd earned. Staying is the only kind of promise that matters. Spring crept over Whitlock in Shy's colors, dandelions in the fence line, new grass rising where the fire had once licked bare. The days lengthened, light blue and clean, and Boone Homestead settled into the steady hush of after storms. The black marks on the barn door wouldn't scrub out, but nobody tried anymore. They let them stay, proof that what stood could survive what burned. Morning routines took root. Elias cooked breakfast at dawn, biscuits rising in the oven, eggs fried crisp, coffee brewed dark enough to stand a spoon in. Tate kept the books, learning numbers from the new ledger, brow furrowed in concentration. Caleb mended fences and cleaned the well, always checking twice to make sure the water ran clear. Silas chased the chickens, Lark at his heels, both shrieking with laughter when feathers flew. Jude gathered kindling, careful with every stick, his small hands quick and sure. Miri swept the porch and taught Lark her letters, her gentle voice turning the kitchen into a place of healing. Huck strung wire along the old back gate, staying a little longer each day, letting the rhythm of the house seep into his bones. On Sundays, Reverend Hale came for supper, his cane tapping the floor, voice warm as June hay. Sometimes they sang, hymn book open, voices joining in ways rough but true. Some nights Elias still kept his boots on by the fire, a habit from all the running years, but more and more he found himself sleeping easy, the rifle by the door less a shield and more a memory. One evening, after chores, Elias sat with Jude on the porch steps, 2 tin cups of coffee cooling in their hands. The wind rippled the grass, carrying the scent of rain and the promise of wildflowers. Jude leaned against him, small but solid, and neither spoke for a long while. The sun dropped behind the hills. The sky washed purple and gold. Jude turned, brow furrowed, searching Elias's face for something unspoken. "You ain't gonna leave, are you?" he asked, voice so soft it almost didn't reach. Elias looked out over the fields, the home he'd built, the family he'd claimed with fists, sweat, and years. "No, son," he answered, the words steady as bedrock. "I'll be here. I ain't going anywhere. Not now, not ever." Jude nodded, content, his trust settling quiet as dust at day's end. Inside, the kitchen glowed with lamplight, the sound of supper being set, laughter spilling under the eaves. The prairie night closed gentle around them, soft as a hymn sung low. Boone Homestead breathed in the hush, the promise kept not in words, but in every chore done, every door left unlocked, every hand held through the storm. Sometimes that's all the West asks of a man. Stay and mean it. If this story struck a chord, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments. Let me know you're here, and don't forget to hit subscribe so you won't miss the next AM. Ride into the Wild West.